So Parshas Tetzaveh is, we can call the Parsha of clothing. In this Parsha we are introduced to this concept that the people who work in the service of Hashem are supposed to wear special clothing which represent their position. That's the basically most of the Parsha. And the Torah uses language, V'asisa bigdei kodesh, you shall make holy clothing, La'aron achicha, to your brother Aaron, L'chavod u'l'sifares, as a honor and a glory, or as a glory and a beauty. You could spend all day trying to translate L'chavod u'l'sifares, but what it means is to make the person adorned and more esteemed through clothing. And the question, I would just like to go straight into, is why should clothing ever do that? Clothing is something which represents the external. It represents what you're trying to show on the outside. Why should clothing ever be an honor and a glory? On the contrary, if you really want to show off how great something is, don't adorn it. Don't bedeck it. Right? The famous joke about the pick your nation or ethnicity that you'd like to insult, and then fill in this joke. Right? Every person has, where they won the gold medal and they had it bronzed for safekeeping. So, when you're wearing nice clothing, you're drawing away attention from the person of who they really are. At least in theory. Again, we say, no, absolutely not. When you wear nice clothing, it makes the person look nicer. But that just means that the person needed the clothing to make them look nice.
I don't know about that. Because
Okay, go ahead.
If you wear if you wear torn clothing or dirty clothing or clothing that's not very nice, I mean, how you present on the outside makes an impression on other people.
Why? Is it because people are shallow and we are...
There may be some of that, but I think it's because, that's
other people?
I don't even know how to put it in words.
Well, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for those words.
Why would we have Shabbos clothes? Why would we have special clothes for
That's
Shabbat?
citation number one. We'll get to that. That's our next question.
I think that what you wear reflects what you are inside.
That's kind of scary, because then I should be able to, whatever clothing I wear, that's what you should assume I am. I mean, the whole concept, I think we always represent the expression to pull the wool over someone's eyes. Mm-hmm. I heard that the source for that was because they wore wigs from sheep's wool, and so blinding someone is to pull the wool over their eyes. Another example of tricking someone would be a wolf in sheep's clothing. All the tricks and the lies are represented by how people dress themselves. And I know we look at clothing as a good thing, and what we'd like to search for is how do we understand how that works?
Well, I'm sorry, one other thing, and that's that we're not talking about the person Aaron or his sons. We're talking about the Kedusha that they're representing.
Right.
So we're not saying, oh, well, Aaron, we have to cover you up because you don't represent enough of, but we're talking about putting somebody in something to try to help inspire and inspire a Kedusha, inspire people to feel the Kedusha, and also for that person to be inspired themselves with the clothing that they wear in that Kedusha.
Okay.
So it can affect people themselves, the way they're dressed.
All right, let's hold on to that thought, because that's a novel idea. Because I think most people, their response would be that it's in order to inspire others.
But when you wear nice clothes, you feel better. Like when you're dressed when you're dressed in a way that's,
All right. No, so I would like to come back to that. That's an important point. But let's address the other direction first, which is what you started to say, which is I think what most people would say, is that they need to wear the clothing so that the people who see them see a representation of the people who are. Why do police officers have uniforms? So that people could recognize them. Why do soldiers have uniforms? So that you're in battle, each side should know who they are. Why do sports athletes wear uniforms? So that they know who's on which side. So usually, clothing is something which is meant to affect people on the outside. And I think that's how most people understand clothing, because most people, when they put on clothing, they think about what is someone else going to think about the way that I'm dressed. And what we'll hopefully try to get to is that that's not what clothing could be. Clothing should be about what we are feeling inside. And they should represent either our feelings or what we would like our feelings to be. Hopefully we'll get there. So let's start with source number one. And I didn't make copies of all these sources because there's quite a few sources. And some of them are... The first is the Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim, Siman Reish Samach Beis. Basic laws of Shabbos, halacha 262, or I should say section 262, halacha 2. Yishtadel, a person should attempt, they should try. You can't obligate people because there have been times when there have been Jews in the world who have not been able to afford special Shabbos clothing. Yishtadel shiyu lo begadim naim l'Shabbos, a person should have nice clothing for Shabbos. Ve'im efshar lo, if you can't, if all you have is one piece of clothing, lefachas yishalshel, so you should sort of bind them up during the week and then let them flow loose on Shabbos or do something to make them look a little nicer for Shabbos as an honor for Shabbos. That's what it says in the Shulchan Aruch, and that's why the custom is that there's actually a disagreement amongst the commentaries. There are some who codify this halacha as a person should not wear weekday clothes on Shabbos, and there are others who say you should not wear Shabbos clothes during the week. And there's a difference between them, between these two opinions. Because if you say you should not wear weekday clothes on Shabbos, then that means that you've got weekday clothes and you've got Shabbos. And on Shabbos, don't wear the same thing you wear during the week. But if you would always wear Shabbos clothes, then you would be allowed to wear those same clothes for Shabbos, because you're not wearing weekday clothes on Shabbos. But on the other hand, if you say don't wear Shabbos clothes during the week, then that would mean that you cannot wear what you would wear on Shabbos during the week. You have to have. The difference is some people, this may sound crazy, but there's some people who spend more than $5,000 on one article of clothing. I guess two. There are people who spend a lot of money on power suits, on these suits. And as a matter of fact, they would be considered, it's considered part of their requirements. They might not even like it, but they might be required by their firm to wear suits that are made by a specific company, and they might even tell them how much they need to be worth because they need to represent themselves. I was recently discussing this with a very prominent businessman who said that actually the style is changing now. And now the big firms want you to wear cheap suits. When I say cheap, I mean like $1,000, right? Which for me is 10 suits. But I mean, they want you to wear cheap suits, as if to say we're worthy without our suits, which is actually related to this topic. But it's a style. It's about what the common thinking is, and that's really what they're doing. They're responding to what people will think. If I walk into a firm of business executives, people who are traders of commodities, and if I work under the impression that the way people dress is probably how successful they are, which is really silly, but that's the way people think, so then I would be required, as part of my job, they write it off on their taxes, that they spent this much money as a business expense. And they're not lying or cheating, that they might not even want to wear a suit that's that expensive. Every time they spill their coffee, they feel like they've just dropped an expensive item and smashed it.
How do you tell? I mean, maybe I just see it.
I can't tell.
How do you tell the difference between a $1,000 suit and a $5,000 suit?
I can't tell.
I mean,
but
you might be able to tell between that and a $25 suit, but, I mean, when you get up past a certain price, I mean, like, how do you tell they're just suits?
Your question, as valid as it is it's just the way it is. People can tell. People can tell. There are people who can walk into the room and tell everyone in this room how much they spent on their shoes. There are people who can do that, and the same people who are experts enough that when with their eyes closed and a car drives by, just from the noise they can tell you the make and model. There are people who are, if you're into something, you can know all about it. And there are people who apparently can look at your clothing, and not only that, they'll make a judgment about you. That's what people are responding to. So then, I guess that's probably the way that the world works, is all of a sudden when everyone starts to wear these suits as if to say, I'm successful, so now all the lars have to take off their stars. All the people have to now wear cheap suits in order to show that they don't need this. But that's the halacha. So it comes out for these people, a person who wears a $5,000 suit during the week, according to the opinion that says that he's not allowed to wear weekday suits on Shabbos, that's not a weekday suit. That's an expensive suit. Then he might be able to. But if you say you're not allowed to wear Shabbos clothing during the weekdays, then he can't say that these are his Shabbos clothing too, because then he would be wearing his Shabbos. Then he'd have to go out and buy an $8,000 suit to wear on Shabbos.
I think that the pasuk that you drew this from, L'chavod L'tifarah, says that you should make these things for Aaron, your brother.
Right.
And I think that needs to be read into this, that hasn't been brought up yet. I think it means that because of this entire time, Moshe, we're coming out of Bashalach, all of the people believe in Moshe, and so on. This is actually setting up a different kind of authority, or a different kind of significance, perhaps, than what we've had so far. So in order to differentiate this activity from that of Moshe's activity, it makes sense that Aaron and his sons, we would have Big Day Kahuna to make this separation, to show that while Moshe is the supreme lawgiver, there's also this other operation which needs to be given a great deal of significance. And if everybody, if they're not distinguished in some way, then perhaps that wouldn't work.
Okay, that could be, but again, you're disagreeing with Dr. Appleson, who suggested that there was internal.
I never disagree with her publicly.
Because these are the two sides that we're approaching here, which is either it's a sort of internal building up the person kind of, which we'll get back to, or we're talking about trying to make a statement to the people who are watching, or maybe it's both. We'll see. But there is something that's happening here in the Torah, where the Torah is telling us that now we're going to introduce clothing as a tool by which to create kavod and tifaras. And it's interesting that the word that is used, we'll get back to this point, the word that's used by the Gemara as the source for why we have to wear clothing on Shabbos is basically from the V'chibadato, which is written in the Navi Yeshaya, and you shall show it honor. And we say that honor represents clothing, and the source for that is this parsha where it says you should make clothing l'chavod u'l'sevaras. So actually, all it says in Yeshaya is that we're supposed to be mechabed Shabbos, l'kavod Shabbos. We don't know what Kavod Shabbos is. It's actually from this week's parsha where we learn that Kavod means that you should wear nice clothing because clothing gives you. So the clothing of Shabbos is on a certain level related to the clothing of the Kohanim. To which the Arizal says, and this is quoted by the Be'eretiv, V'ha'arizal kasav yesh lilbosh daled bigdei lavan. A person should wear 4 articles of clothing that are white. Malbish ha'elyon, an overshirt or an overcoat or a robe, whatever they wore in those days. On Shabbos. V'hatachton, and then basically the pants. V'ha'ezor, and a belt. V'ha'chaluk, and a shirt. In other words, the halacha is that a person is required to wear white clothing on Shabbos, according to the Arizal, at least white pants, a white shirt, a white jacket, and a white belt. And that's what a person should wear on Shabbos. Why? Kneged dalid osios havaya, to correspond with the 4 letters of Hashem's name.
Why they were gonna say the
black?
4.
Why is it tradition they could be wearing 4 black pieces?
So why white? So the answer, which is suggested, is that it corresponds with the clothing of the Kohanim. That the Kohanim, who are in the service of Hashem, wear 4 articles of white clothing corresponding to the name Yud Kei Vav Kei, which represents purity and as we'll see in a second, represents mercy. So because of that, you're supposed to, the Arizal would wear, and that's why you see the Mekubalim. Now, today's days, we wear more than 4 articles of clothing. In the Middle East, there are people who still, if they wore 4 articles of clothing, maybe they're a little overdressed in some places. But basically, 4 articles of clothing would make sense for a person to wear.
What about their hat?
So it sounds like the hat can be of any color. I mean, they wore turbans in those days. So I guess you can have a white turban, but when we talk about, is it because one of the clothing of the Kohanim was that? But right. So the Sefer Agra de Pirka, which is written by the Bnei Yissaschar, one of his Sfarim, he quotes Bekisei Melech from the Sefer Kisei Melech. Halovesh bigdei lavan b'Shabbos, one who wears white clothing on Shabbos, mechaprim alavon harayos mitzuraf im teshuva. Then if he does teshuva, he's forgiven for all sins of immorality. Wearing white clothing on Shabbos is an atonement for any sins of immorality. So he says, I don't understand how this is possible, because we know that sins of immorality come with very serious punishments. So how could a person, you might need tshuva, Yom Kippur, suffering, how could just wearing white clothing, how could that be enough? He says, and don't suggest that wearing white clothing is considered suffering, which I guess maybe if you wear it after September, what's the rule? Right? So maybe that's, he says, it's not, Ve'efshar loma.
To worry if something spills on it.
Right. Well,
It gets
maybe.
ruined very quickly.
Bad for children.
Right. So he wants to suggest, the Bnei Yissaschar, that we know that a person who needs to suffer can suffer in many ways. Sometimes a person can suffer that they're late for a very important thing, especially something they like. Let's say their favorite musician is having a concert and they're stuck in traffic. Now, while they're stuck in traffic and they're missing the first 3 or 4 songs, that's a very big deal for such people. Ever try talking to a person like that and ask them, like, how was your day and things like that? That person is suffering. Suffering worse than as if they were going through some terrible physical illness. People are like that. But we have to realize that that's the good kind of suffering. Yeah, we lost out on something good, but that's the kind of suffering which in the end we can handle. None of us want to handle what is real difficult suffering. The Gemara says that if you put your hand into one pocket in order to pull out coins, but it turns out it's in the other pocket. So that's frustrating. That frustration is considered an atonement. But it's so easy. Right? So I'm in the store, I can't find that penny. I know I had a penny in one of these pockets, and I feel around and I'm looking for it, and I get frustrated. So says the Bnei Yissaschar that it could be that by wearing white clothing on Shabbos, you somehow shift all your sufferings. You're still going to have to suffer. You can't just get atonement by wearing white clothing. But by wearing white clothing on Shabbos, that's a special prayer that all your sufferings should be the easy to handle, very simple kind. So he's trying to answer the question, but we see clearly from whatever sefer he's quoting from the Kisei Melech that this wearing of white clothing on Shabbos is a very big deal, and somehow the white clothing and the 4 letters of God's name bring mercy down on people. And the question is, why should they? He's trying to explain it doesn't really bring that much mercy, but still, why should the wearing of clothing have that kind of effect on you? The Minhag Yisrael Torah wonders. He quotes this from the Sefer Divrei Torah. This is a Sefer called Minhag Yisrael Torah, a beautiful Sefer where he basically justifies every minhag that exists. He explains what the source for it is. It's a good Sefer. Maybe at some point we should study it. But he asks, why is it that isn't more prominent? Why isn't that more common? That people wear white clothing. I mean, in every community, you've got 1 or 2 people, mostly people who are Sephardic. But this should be common that all Jews should keep. It's a very simple thing to keep. Yeah, I mean, it's messy, and maybe you have to all wear house robes when we eat so that we don't constantly have to. But why isn't this done? So he quotes from the Sefer Panim Me'iros that says that this should not be done today because it's considered a level of haughtiness. And then he quotes from the Sefer Ruach Chaim that says that white clothing is only for someone, let me get the exact text that he has here, for a person who's shalem b'shleimus, completely complete, ubekavanos, and has all the proper intentions in all of his prayers, in all his blessings, in piety, and in the Kabbalistic understandings of things, for a person to wear white clothing. I'm not there. Maybe everyone else here is there. And if you are there, you should be wearing white clothing on Shabbos. But if you're not there, that's the reason. Because the white clothing represent a certain place for where you are. And if you're not there, maybe you're wearing clothing that are above your grade. And that is exactly the lesson that we're trying to find. Is that wearing different kinds of clothing are statements to yourself about who you are. And wearing clothing, certain types of clothing that make statements about you to yourself that aren't necessarily true about yourself, is almost like telling a lie. If you represent yourself in a certain way and you're not that way, that's why we might be bothered if we see someone who wears very religious garb and then they do something inappropriate. So really, we don't say to the person, well, how could you do such a thing? I'd say a little differently. How dare you dress yourself up and wear such clothing as if you live by a certain standard or code of law, and then act this way? But why are you even mentioning the person's clothing? Shouldn't it be that you should challenge the person for their behavior itself? Right? We say, look at this person dressed up in a long black coat, and still I'm just using an example, I don't mean anyone specifically, and still he was caught cheating on, in business dealings. How could he wear that long black coat? How could he wear the long black coat? How could he cheat in business? That's a universal crime. Right?
Because when you do things while obviously identifying yourself as a member of a particular group, your actions reflect on that group.
Right.
So if you do something good, it's Kiddush Hashem, it reflects well on that group. If you do something badly, the crime isn't just the crime that you yourself committed. It reflects on the whole.
And let's say it doesn't reflect on the group. Let's say we know that that's an example of something which is not prevalent. I would still say, don't present yourself as if you are some kind of very strict adherent to certain laws. Again, not just because of what it represents to the group, even if other people don't know.
I would have a little bit of difficulty with that because there's no one who's exempt from Yom Kippur. We all make mistakes. We all do things we shouldn't do, and we're on and many of us, dress the part, and we make mistakes. And everyone needs Yom Kippur. So just because someone's dressed like a frum Jew and does something wrong doesn't mean that they're necessarily a hypocrite, which many people will say, well, how could you do that? I would save that just for the most heinous of things.
Right. Well, you're right in that we wouldn't say it for something which would fall within the category of, listen, everyone's entitled to their mistakes. We jump on people when they do things. You know what? Let's all judge ourselves first, kind of thing. Absolutely. But we're talking about a person who's maybe done something long term, maybe even misrepresented themselves all these years as having been someone when really they were, they just, doing other things. Trying to avoid the example. But there is this concept of how could you represent yourself in a certain way when you're not? Who's the one that should call them out on it? It shouldn't be me or any of us.
Is it not a little bit like, the point you're making, taking something that's made out of inferior materials and then that you're selling and putting some kind of gloss on it that covers this up,
right,
so that it looks like it's something else.
Right. So that's a really good example. You see, I'm allowed to take my tin Kiddush cup and get it painted with gold paint and use that for my Kiddush. And no one can walk into my house and say, you faker, you liar, you thief, look at you pretending to have a gold cup. I can feel its weight and it feels like tin, right? Because gold would be heavier. I can do whatever I want. I can represent myself to myself, but I think what you're saying is more important. If you're selling something based on that type of, based on it being a certain way, if you are selling something based on that, if what you're selling is only true, if someone showed up and they were a bad person and they were coming and they were teaching something, but Ezu Chacham Alomed Mikal Adam, who is wise? Someone who learns from everyone. We're supposed to learn even from people who aren't religiously observant, or we consider to be inferior than us. I don't know if such a thing exists as anyone who's inferior to us, but we like to consider certain people that way. But if what you're selling is based off of representing a certain thing in a certain way, where you say, look at me, I'm a certain way, and therefore people should follow me, and that turns out to not be true, that's really bad. That's bad.
Fraud.
Right. And clothing is such a great instrument of that kind of fraud. And so what we're worried about is if someone puts on the white clothing. If someone puts on the white clothing, they're making a statement about themselves. And then people buy in to that person and to what they represent. And then when they start telling people that it's okay to do this and it's okay to do that, and people, once they're sold on that person, they start to follow, and that's how we have many of our false messiahs. They didn't show up looking like false messiahs. They showed up looking like sheep, and they turned out to be wolves in sheep's clothing.
Somewhat tangential, but still related to that, what bothers me the most is when a person who is identified with a group whom the observers identify with God,
Right.
whoever they consider God. In a case like that, their actions reflect a group representative to the observers as a representative of God or the God of the Jews. That's where I feel it can be more
Right,
serious.
right.
because
Unfortunately,
it's reflected.
right. Unfortunately, every person who gets arrested for any reason, who has a long beard and wears a black coat, is in the headlines. It won't say man of Hebrew descent. It'll say rabbi arrested,
Right.
even though this person knows less about Judaism than my 5-year-old. Right? But because they have that's just the way it is, and that's unfortunate. Right, and that's part of the disadvantage of the clothing. What we're saying here is that we have people not wear the white, because you wear the white if you feel that what you're selling, what you represent, is something which you can follow up on. Something that you can practice, not what you preach. You can preach without, because if someone shows up and says, "I'm not a religious Jew, but let me tell you about Judaism," you might still be able to learn. But if you wouldn't be able to emulate that person. Okay, let's take a break from this just for a little bit. We're going to start a different topic, and we're going to come back to this. The Noda B'Yehuda, one of the great halachists of the last few hundred years, deals with an interesting question. It's actually in his first response in all of the Noda B'Yehuda. Rabbi Cheskel Landau was the chief rabbi in Prague in the 18th century. The question sent to him was that there was a certain tefillin paint. Paint is used to make tefillin black. It's actually hide, which is not naturally black. You have to paint it black. So there was a tefillin paint that had in it, I know we'd never allow this today, but that's what they had. Basically, crumbs, not crumbs, but little pieces of ivory. That's what gave you think today would be so expensive, but I guess it was common then. Basically, ground elephant tusk was one of the ingredients in the paint. And the question, again, this is before they realized that they were destroying the elephants, but the question was, is that a kosher paint to use for tefillin? What's the problem? Problem is that elephants are not kosher. And something made from elephant would therefore be using a non-kosher product on a holy object.
But you're not supposed to eat
Oh.
not kosher things. Are there any other prohibitions?
So when it comes to tefillin, and in certain other cases it says, min hamosar beficha, which we darshan basically, that the tefillin have to be made from things which are kosher.
Okay.
Right? By tefillin, a special law, it might apply in some other cases. So he prohibits it because he says that that's using a non-kosher product in the production of tefillin. However, he questions this because it's not really made in the production of the tefillin. It's only an ingredient within the paste which paints the tefillin. So he leaves it as a sort of open question. That's the Noda B'Yehuda. The Chassam Sofer, probably the Noda B'Yehuda and the Chassam Sofer were probably the two greatest halachists of the last 300 years. The Chassam Sofer of Moshe Sofer, who lived in Pressburg a little bit later than the Noda B'Yehuda, he disagrees with the Noda B'Yehuda, and he says that it would be prohibited, that one would not allow to use ivory shavings or ivory crumbs in the production of tefillin. A fascinating question, and to go all through all the halachic parts, that would be, of this discussion would be a whole study to itself. However, one of the commentaries, Rav Meir Robinson, who wrote glosses on the response of the Noda B'Yehuda, says, I don't understand what these great rabbis are talking about. They missed a very important basic commentary. The commentary of Rabbeinu Bachye on the clothing of the Kohanim. Rabbeinu Bachye, when discussing the clothing, asks a great question. Gold, silver, copper, blue wool, purple wool, what's missing? in terms of ingredients to really create beautiful clothing for the Kohanim? What ingredient is missing? What?
Cotton.
I wouldn't say that's beautiful.
So,
Silk.
Silk. Ask Rabbeinu Bachye, why was there no silk in the Mishkan? I'll read. V'lo matzinu meshi benidvas HaMishkan. There's no silk anywhere in the Mishkan, not in the Mishkan itself, and not in the clothing of the Kohanim. Lefi shehu yotze miguf hasheretz shehu hatolas, because it comes from a worm. V'lo huchsher l'malachas shamayim ela davar tahor, and you cannot use for the heavenly work only something which is kosher. Of course, this raises big issues with the chilazon, which we'll get to in a minute. And this raises questions about the tachash. And actually our sages tell us that that's one of the proofs that the tachash was a kosher animal. The Sichas Chulin uses this as one of his proofs that the tachash is a giraffe, because a giraffe is kosher. However, says the Rabbeinu Bachye, Tetzaveh tolas shani. Now, what about the red dye? The red dye which was made from the worm, which gives off a red ooze. Eina migufa telas. He says that doesn't come from the body of the worm. Ela mitoch gargarim shatolas besocham. It comes from these shells which the worm comes out of, like the shells.
Like snails? Like the
Right. And so these worms, or whatever these creatures are, the red dye is not the blood or some secretion of the animal, but is some other kind of thing. Therefore, don't ask from the red wool, because the red wool is not a question. Which makes it very clear from Rabbeinu Bachye that if the dye or the coloring would come from the body of the animal, then there would be a problem. And ivory does come from the body of the elephant, and therefore it should not be kosher. Now the problem is it's not edible, but still it comes from the body of the elephant, and therefore that's why it would not be kosher to use. So it's difficult to understand why the Noda B'Yehuda and the Chassam Sofer sort of ignore this statement by Rabbeinu Bachye. That's the question that he asks.
Tusk is part of the body of the animal. He could lose the tusk and still live very well.
Right, but you wouldn't call it an external, just from the shell or from the...
Well, I don't know, do tusks fall off? Do they fall off?
I don't think they fall off, but I think
They never fall off and grow new ones?
I imagine they grow. I don't think they keep regrowing, because I think these animals, once you cut their tusks off, they're sort of helpless. That's part of why they're endangered, is because people cut them off that way. I mean, maybe it does go a little bit back, but I always see these pictures of this elephant with one full tusk and one half tusk. Right? That's
Just a real quick question. So from what you read, does that mean that you shouldn't wear silk clothing on Shabbat?
and we're getting to that now.
Oh, okay.
So the Chassam Sofer says that he doesn't understand why so many Jews use silk in adorning a shul. And he says so many of the things which we do to adorn our shuls, whether it's the wrapping around the Sefer Torah or these silk scarves that the Sephardim use around the Sefer Torah, he says, I don't understand why they use silk, when it's very clear from Rabbeinu Bachye that silk is something which we don't use in the Beis HaMikdash. Now we'll get to clothing in a second, because clothing might be personal, but clearly in the production of the Mishkan we discouraged or did not want to use any silk. So Chassam Sofer sort of leaves it as a question, says, I don't know why people are using silk on the Sefer Torah, on the Aron Kodesh, on all through the shuls, maybe the curtains or whatever it is else that they were using silk for at the time. Interesting, right? You'd never think that this would be an issue. But the Maggid of Trisk, who is a great Hasidic rabbi, he says, how come so many Jews wear silk clothing on Shabbos? the Hasidic garb, the bekisha, is basically a silk cloth, a silk robe. There's a reason why they're so expensive. They're made from they are silk robes, and it used to be that the Hasidim were referred to by the Sephardim, who didn't interact much with them, as the silk wearers, because in those days they didn't really have very good technology to be able to distinguish between clothing that had wool and linen mixed into it. And since most people wore wool or linen, it was very easy to transgress the prohibition of wearing clothing of a mixture of wool and linen. There is one material which is very easy to differentiate between that and other materials, and that's silk. So the Sephardim were always impressed by the Hasidim wearing silk clothing in order to avoid any issues of wearing wool and linen.
Is that why they did it?
That is one of the reasons why that was adopted. It sort of avoids that prohibition entirely, because wearing wool and linen, a mixture of wool and linen, somehow weakens a person's ability to pray. So, the Sefer Minig Yisrael Torah says that the Maggid of Trisks resolves this, that yes, maybe there is something about not wearing silk when it comes to holy things, like the clothing of the Kohen, because that would be introducing something impure. However, he says, the advantage of wearing silk outweighs the disadvantage. Why? Because silk comes from basically the excrement or the excretion of a worm. And this leads you to humility and lowliness. One of the things that we're supposed to think about is that's one of the three things we're supposed to look at, is where do we come from? We come from nothing. And where are we going to? We're all going to end up being worms and maggots. So that lesson is so important that outweighs any disadvantage of wearing yes.
But I think silk gives off the opposite impression. Even though it comes from a worm, that's not the way people view it.
Yeah,
they view it as, wow, I've got this beautiful silk dress or suit or whatever it may be, silk ties. I don't think people think of it that way. If people would say, oh, you're wearing a silk tie, oh, yeah, it comes from worms. If that was the way it was viewed, then I could understand this, but it's not viewed that way. People think of silk as like a very special garment.
Right, but if you remember earlier, we had a disagreement, we won't mention names, but one person said that the clothing was really about how you perceive it and the approach that you take, and the other person said it was about how other people might perceive it. I think that's more going into how other people are going to see it. If other people will focus on the expense of it, but if it's up to me, if it's about me, then I choose whatever perspective I want to take on the clothing.
That's people's perspective. They don't pay megabucks to buy a silk dress or a silk suit to think of it as coming from a worm. I can wear this because...
Well, we're saying they should. You'll never be able to get someone else to see it that way. But if your clothing is about the messages you're sending yourself, if you're wearing dark clothing today because you're feeling in a darker mood, and it's not about what someone else thinks, then other people might never see that you're in that mood. But that's you, between yourself, you're dealing or venting that frustration you feel with darker clothing. If you're feeling a little bit more anxious, and you wear clothing that represent that as a way to release that anxiety, so then that's between you and your clothing. And if wearing silk clothing is meant as a lesson, I'll tell you that I once heard from one of my Rosh Hashivas, who he said that when the Rosh Hashiva reaches a certain level, you may have noticed this, he starts to wear a frock. A frock is a longer coat, which the Hasidim, even when they're young, they wear, but in the yeshiva world, they usually wear just a suit jacket. But if you become a big Rosh Hashiva, you walk around with a long cloak, it's called a frock. So the frock, he said that the first time he put one on, he reached a certain level of Rosh Hashiva, however that works, there's a system for it. So he put on, and he said the first time he went to put his hands in his pockets, frocks don't have pockets. And the thought that came to him was, you know what else doesn't have pockets? Shrouds don't have pockets. A kittel doesn't have pockets because shrouds don't have pockets. Shrouds don't have pockets because nothing you're taking with. And so when he put on this clothing, he says, as much as it was, this is what he told us, he told his students, that as much as this clothing was meant to be, I've now reached a higher level of Rosh Hashiva, all he can think about is that these are my shrouds. It's how we take the clothing. It's what we do with it on some level. And what I think that we have to, in order to make shalom, is the fact is that really both are true. Absolutely both are true. Clothing is both a message to people on the outside and a message to myself on the inside. I can wear clothing because I need to be motivated to do a job. So I can be a police officer and wear an officer's uniform so that people who are looking for a police officer can identify me and find me. But I can also put on that officer's uniform so that I should think twice before I do something, because if a police officer takes from a store and doesn't pay for it, it'll be on YouTube tomorrow. If he does anything, it'll be because that clothing, it creates an expectation. Every time we put on certain clothing, we're making statements to ourselves and we're making statements to others. Shabbos, we're saying right now, is maybe more about yourself. And where you're, if you're wearing special silk clothing on Shabbos, which is when these people wear silk clothing, and maybe there is an element of, for the outside, you should represent yourself as a king, but really the lesson is for yourself. So on Shabbos, you wear the white clothing as a way to inspire yourself to maybe be a little higher. And unfortunately, we're not on that level. We're still struggling to represent our civilian clothing. And we're not ready to take that step to put on the fancy clothing. Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen writes, unbelievable statement. He says, the Medrash Rabbah, based on the Medrash Rabbah, says that the kosnos or the Adam Arishon, the clothing of hide that God puts on Adam, are big day kahuna and they are big day Shabbos. They are big day kahuna and they are big day Shabbos. On the clothing of Adam, when God gives him clothing, is because before there was a sin, there was no difference between the inside and the outside of a person. I didn't have to misrepresent myself. I couldn't misrepresent myself. There was no need for clothing because there was no need to represent at all. But once there new concept of my inside being different than my outside, which is what happens at the sin, when Adam and Chava eat from the tree, all of a sudden, they represent themselves one way, and they seem a different way. Now all of a sudden we need clothing. We need clothing to cover up the shame of what we're really doing and thinking on the inside. And the clothing that they get are clothing to elevate them. They were depressed, they were down, and they were given clothing of Big Day Shabbos and Big Day Kahuna. So Reb Tzadok writes, the al yidei haksus miskadesh, that when a person puts on the clothing, special Shabbos clothing, before Shabbos, that is an act of changing you. It's not just changing on the inside, but you are pulling yourself out and trying to elevate you. It's not about other people. when you put on Shabbos clothing, you put on clothing that don't represent who you are, but they represent what you're trying to get yourself to be. And that's why we put on nicer clothing on Shabbos, not just to honor Shabbos, which is true. We do show Shabbos honor by putting on nicer clothing, but we are also pushing ourselves to be cleaner people. We are pushing ourselves to be more representative, a better representative of purity and sanctity. He says, "Aval bigdei Shabbos sheyesh behem kedusha lahakdish guf halovsham hu kefi achanas ha'adam v'argashasa b'kedushas Shabbos," that the power of the Shabbos clothing to sanctify you is how much you feel the sanctity and the kedusha of Shabbos. You elevate your clothing, and your clothing elevates you. So it could be that the reason why we have two words, lekavod ultifares, that it could be that lekavod is more about you and what you feel on the inside. And the word kavod, which represent, even though you think kavod is usually associated with others, but kavod is sort of honor within myself, the esteem which I feel, and that's true of Shabbos. That's why on Shabbos the clothing we wear is the kavod Shabbos. It's all meant for us, for ourselves, how we honor and esteem ourselves. But for Aaron, they needed to be both. Aaron did not see himself as being fit, and others did not see Aaron as being fit. And the clothing, and I think this is what Dr. Absalom was saying earlier about the other half, about maybe, you were referring to the other people, right?
Yes.
Right? So the other people looked at Aaron and said, all these other people who worshipped the golden calf were killed or punished in some way, and Aaron, is somehow rewarded. And there needed to be a statement made by Hashem as the Tifares, this beautification of Aaron and this glorification of Aaron, that it's not just Aaron being sent to some position, but he's a higher person. But more so, Aaron himself might have felt himself lacking. He might have questioned whether he's deserving. And so we get Aaron to put on this clothing to push him to realize that he needs to lift himself up above, that he needs to, the clothing makes a demand from him. So we started off asking, when someone wears clothing, what are they thinking, and what should they be thinking, and what's this idea of wearing fancy clothing? It could be that maybe these business people are not so wrong. If I ask you a question, which is, a person goes for a job interview. They're going for a job interview. Many people who go for a job interview, they will borrow a suit or rent a suit or something that represents them as being better. Is that the seat? In certain yeshivas, they would have one fancy suit, and whoever was going out on a date would wear that fancy suit to make themselves look respectable. And if there were two guys going on dates, they would have to stagger the dates so that one can come home, switch the suit, and let the other person do it. Is that misrepresentation? So it depends on how you understand clothing. If clothing is only meant, well, it could be in that case maybe, but in the case of the person who's a business applying for a job, he's not saying I am this way. I want you to see me this way as to what I can become. If I have a job, I do plan on dressing this way, because you do not want to show up to the interview in a $3,000 suit and then show up to your first day of work in jeans and a t-shirt. That's not going to fly anywhere. So I am going to... but I'm just saying, I need you to see me from this kind of perspective. That's not the seat. Clothing can make you who you are, and you can make the clothing into what they are. But the best relationship is for a person to use clothing as a way to elevate themselves, to push themselves to do more. On Shabbos, when you wear nice clothing, I think you use this language, when you wear nice clothing, you feel good. You feel good about it, and that's what you're supposed to do on Shabbos. You're supposed to feel good, not just about the clothing, but about yourself. And that's why we are instructed in halacha to wear special Shabbos clothing, even if you're not in the mood. Even if you're not in the mood. That's not lying, it's not deceit. It's actually a tool to help your mood, to change your mood, to affect yourself, and in order to make us better people. Clothing is a sort of curse. It is a curse. We're not supposed to be wearing clothing. We should be beyond the need for clothing. I'm assuming that we wouldn't have Chicago kind of weather. But when we do have clothing, HaKadosh Baruch Hu offered us all these different things, whether it's silk, whether it's wool or cotton. We have to recognize the gifts that Hashem gives us, and our goals should be to always use all these things to our advantage, to elevate ourselves, and to try to represent whatever we are in the best way. Thank you.
Thank you.